This is The Last Climb. Today, I'll cover the egotistic couple that Climbing World wanted nowhere near K2, but still managed to end up on the deadliest mountain on Earth regardless. They had the money, the power, and the kind of arrogance that got other people killed, yet they were not satisfied until they summited the most dangerous place on Earth. What happened to them up there is something the mountaineering community still does not like to talk about. It was July 25th, 2019, and high in the death zone of K2, in the narrow killing funnel that mountaineers simply call the bottleneck, a wealthy, middle-aged couple who had been quietly banned from every reputable expedition on Earth were clipped to a rope they had not paid to fix, above 26,000 feet of mountain, finally about to answer for the 12 people who never came home 5 years before. Their names were Nigel and Vivian Wexley, and by the time they reached K2, they were already infamous in the small, tight world of high-altitude climbing. The kind of infamous that gets your name passed quietly between guides as a warning. They were rich, the sort of rich that had never once been told no and meant it. Nigel from a family construction fortune and Vivian from a chain of fitness studios she had sold for a number that made the rest of their lives a formality. They were in their early 50s. Fit in the way that personal trainers and expensive recovery can make a person fit. And they had decided, somewhere in their late 40s, that what their lives were missing was the one thing money is not supposed to be able to buy. They wanted to be mountaineers. Not to climb, exactly, but to be the kind of people who had climbed. To own the photographs and the dinner party stories, and the quiet superiority of having stood where almost no one stands. They wanted the identity without the apprenticeship, the summit without the decade of cold and fear and failure that earns it. And they had the money to skip every single step that was supposed to earn it, to hire the skill they did not have and rent the experience they had never lived, and to paper over the gap with a story so polished that strangers believed it, and eventually, so did they. The resume they built was a work of fiction, and it was beautiful. On paper, by the time they approached the big mountains, Nigel and Vivian had a climbing history that would have taken most people 2 decades of hard apprenticeship to earn. There were summits listed that they had paid to be short roped up by exhausted guides while contributing almost nothing of their own. There were peaks they claimed to have done that they had only trekked to the base of, and 1 or 2 they appear never to have visited at all. There were photographs, carefully framed and carefully cropped, that showed them triumphant on summits with the real work. The guides and the porters and the fixed lines and the oxygen edited neatly out of the frame, so that 2 people who had been hauled up like luggage looked like conquerors who had done it themselves. They had a slick website, a sponsor or 2 who never checked a single claim, a wall of framed certificates, and a story they told so often and so well at dinners and fundraisers that they had clearly come to believe it themselves. On paper, they were serious alpinists with the scars to prove it. In reality, they were 2 wealthy tourists who had never once, not for a single hour, been responsible for their own survival on a mountain. Now, I have seen fake climbing resumes before, but never one built this carefully. They did not just exaggerate, they manufactured an entire career and spent real money making sure no one looked too closely. All they're hurting is themselves. To understand what they walked into and what they would later cause, you have to understand K2. It is the 2nd highest mountain in the world at just over 28,000 feet, and it is, by almost every measure that matters, the deadliest of the giant peaks to climb. For decades, roughly 1 person died for every 4 who reached the top, a rate many times worse than Everest. It is steeper than Everest, more technical, more exposed, and far more remote, with no real rescue possible high on the mountain because no helicopter can fly that high and no one can carry you down terrain that vertical. There is no well-oiled commercial machine the way there is on Everest. Fewer fixed ropes, fewer hands to help, far less margin for a person who cannot look after themselves. And near the top sits the thing that has killed more people on K2 than anything else, the bottleneck. A narrow, steep gully that every climber on the standard route must pass through, directly beneath a gigantic overhanging cliff of ancient ice called a serac. That serac sheds chunks the size of houses without warning, and there is no way to predict it and no way around it. The only defense is speed, getting through the bottleneck fast, ideally in the dark before the day warms the ice. a slow team in the bottleneck is not just in danger itself. It is a loaded gun pointed at everyone behind it.
That last part is the key to this whole story, and I need you to remember it. On K2, being slow does not just endanger you, it traps everyone behind you under that hanging ice.
In the summer of 2014, K2 had one of its busiest seasons in history, a rare stretch of good weather that drew dozens of climbers into a narrow window, all of them aiming for the same few summit days. Nigel and Vivienne were among them, having bought their way onto a permit and into a loose international group on the strength of that fabricated resume. The experienced climbers around them sized them up within days, the way professionals always do, and quietly grew alarmed. The Wexleys were slow, far slower than they had claimed, slower than anyone that high should be. They were clumsy with their own gear, fumbling clips and crampons that a real alpinist handles without thinking. They did not understand the rope work, the careful etiquette of who passes whom and when on a single fixed line. And they treated the Sherpas and the guides with the breezy entitlement of people used to being served, issuing requests like room service orders at 26,000 feet. But they had paid, and they had the paperwork. And on a crowded mountain with no central authority and no one empowered to send anyone home, the alarm stayed private. Nobody could stop them. So they went up with everyone else toward the bottleneck on one of the most crowded summit days that Brutal Mountain had ever seen. There were people on that mountain who saw it coming and said so. A veteran guide later described warning his own clients to get ahead of the slow couple at all costs, to not get stuck behind them in the bottleneck for any reason. Messages passed between tents at the high camp the night before the push, climbers quietly agreeing that the Wexleys had no business going up, that they would be a hazard to everyone. But there is a brutal code on these mountains that everyone is responsible for themselves, and no one had the authority or the will to physically stop two paying adults from clipping into the same ropes as everyone else. So the warnings stayed warnings. Everyone went up together, and the slow couple, who should never have been within 100 miles of that mountain, ended up right in the middle of the line, deep in the bottleneck at the worst possible moment.
The fact that everyone already knew what was going on is crazy to me. A whole camp of experienced people saw these two were in danger, and the unwritten rules of the mountain meant not one of them could stop it.
What exactly triggered it has been argued about ever since, but the shape of it is not in dispute. High in the bottleneck, on that crowded day, Nigel Wexley froze. Exhausted far beyond his fake fitness, gripped by the altitude and the exposure, he stopped moving on the fixed line, clipped in, unable to go up or down, and Vivienne stopped behind him. And because there is only one rope and one path through that gully, everyone behind them stopped too. A long line of climbers backed up under the serac in the heat of the day, in the exact place where every minute is a gamble with your life, waiting on a couple who could not move. People begged them to clip past, to unclip and let others through, and in the chaos and the thin air, it did not happen fast enough. Precious time bled away, the kind of time that on K2 is measured in lives, while the sun kept working on the ice above. They were stuck under that serac for far, far too long, a whole line of people held hostage by two who never should have been there. And then, the way it always eventually does on K2, the serac let go.
Be honest with me in the comments. Stuck on that rope, watching two people put everyone in danger under that ice, would you be able to hold yourself back before you did something drastic to force your way past them?
The collapse swept the crowded line. A wall of ice came down through the bottleneck and tore away climbers and fixed ropes together, and in the span of a few seconds, the most dangerous traffic jam on Earth turned into a catastrophe. By the time it was over, across that terrible day and the freezing night that followed, 12 people did not come down. Some died in the fall, torn off the face by the ice. Some were swept off the mountain entirely and never found. And some, the cruelest part, survived the collapse only to find the fixed ropes gone, the single thread they needed to get down simply erased, stranding them above the broken line with no safe way back. Those climbers spent the night where no human body can last, above 26,000 feet in the dark, where the cold reaches deep past 40 below, and the thin air slowly strips away the strength and the clear thinking a person needs to save themselves. One by one, through that long night, the stranded gave out, exactly the way the death zone always takes people, slowly and then all at once. Among the dead were guides and Sherpas who had spent the whole day trying to manage the chaos in the bottleneck. The very people who had seen this coming and gone up anyway because it was their job to look after the clients who could not look after themselves. Families across several countries lost someone that day. And in the middle of all of it, somehow, impossibly, Nigel and Vivian Wexley survived. They had been just high enough on the line, just lucky enough in where they clung, that the ice missed them by a margin measured in feet. They came down off K2 alive, into a world that was about to start asking exactly what had happened up there. Here is where this story turns from a tragedy into something much darker. Because Nigel and Vivian Wexley did not come home humbled. They came home with a story. Before the families of the dead had even been notified, Vivian was on the satellite phone from base camp, shaping the narrative, calling contacts, getting ahead of it, and by the time they reached a hotel in Pakistan, they had a version of events ready, polished, and utterly false. In their telling, they had been victims, not causes. They had been heroes, even, who had tried to help others and been failed by the chaos around them. They blamed the dead, the people who could no longer speak, for the slowness and the confusion in the bottleneck. They gave interviews to outlets that had no way to check a word of it. They leaned on every fact that could not be verified and quietly buried everyone that could. And they did it with the smooth confidence of people who had spent their whole lives controlling how a room saw them. And because they were articulate and wealthy and well-dressed, and the survivors who actually knew the truth were grieving or traumatized or simply dead, the Wexleys very nearly got away with it completely clean. Then they went further, and this is the detail I find hardest to forgive. Within a year, Nigel and Vivian had a book, a glossy, ghost-written memoir of survival and resilience, with their faces on the cover and the dead used as background scenery for their courage. There were chapters about their bravery, their bond, the lessons the mountain had taught them, and barely a real word about the 12 people whose deaths had made the story sellable in the first place. They did a small media tour. They spoke at events. They let themselves be introduced as survivors of one of the great mountain tragedies, as though they had been victims of it rather than its cause. And when one widow, the wife of a guide who had died trying to manage the very jam they created, spoke out publicly and named them as the reason her husband was gone, the Wexleys did what people like them always do. They threatened to sue her. They sent expensive lawyers at a grieving woman who had a fraction of their money, accused her of defamation, buried her in letters and threats, and frightened her into silence. The truth was out there, known to everyone inside the climbing world, but the Wexleys had money and lawyers and a book deal, and the dead had none of those things.
Then they wrote a book, put their faces on the cover, and turned 12 dead people into the backdrop of their survival story. They even sued the widow who told the truth, and I cannot think of anything more inhumane.
But the climbing world has a long memory, and it has its own kind of justice, even when the law and the money fail. There is no official global authority that can ban a climber from the mountains, no central list, no badge that gets taken away, no court that rules you may never set foot on a peak again. What there is, instead, is reputation and word of mouth, and the quiet network of guides and outfitters and base camp managers who actually run these expeditions and talk constantly among themselves. And in the years after K2, that network closed against the Wexleys like a door. The reputable companies, the ones who knew exactly what had happened up there, refused to take them at any price. Guides who had heard the story, and everyone had heard the story, would not rope up with them for any amount of money. Base camp managers noted their names. They were, in every way that the mountains actually recognize, banned, marked permanently as the couple who got 12 people killed and then blamed the bodies and sued the widow. They simply were not welcome among serious people anymore. Any honest person in the business would have looked them in the eye and told them to go home and never come back. The trouble is that the business is not made up only of honest people.
There's no official ban list in climbing, no card they can take away, but I promise you, these two were banned in every way that counts. Every good guide on Earth had quietly decided they were done.
So the Wexleys did what their money had always let them do. They went around it. If the reputable companies would not have them, there were always others. The bottom of the market. The operators who would put anyone on any mountain for a large enough check and ask no questions about the past. With those, and with the same fabricated resume, padded now with the K2 survival they had spun into heroism, Nigel and Vivian kept climbing. They bagged peaks across the world in the years that followed, collecting summits the way they collected everything, leaving behind a trail of furious guides and terrified teammates and near misses that should have killed them a dozen times over. On one mountain, a Sherpa blew out his shoulder, hauling Nigel off a slope he had frozen on, and never climbed the same again. On another occasion, a teammate gave up his own summit to turn back and walk a faltering Vivian down, and got a threat of a lawsuit for his trouble when he later described it honestly. Every mountain was another chance for the reckoning to arrive, and every time, somehow, it was someone else who paid the bill for their recklessness. They were a disaster that kept happening to other people, until they went back to the one mountain that does not let anyone, no matter how rich, outrun what they actually are. Think about every warning these two got. 12 deaths, an entire industry shutting its doors, years of near misses. They kept going anyway, because nothing in their lives had ever taught them that a no could be real. In the summer of 2019, 5 years after the disaster they caused, Nigel and Vivian Wexley went back to K2. Maybe it was to reclaim the summit that had nearly killed them, to finally stand on top and complete the story their book had only promised. Maybe they had simply started to believe their own legend, the one where they were survivors and heroes rather than the reason a dozen families had empty chairs at the table. Maybe, after 5 years of being quietly shut out by everyone who mattered, they needed to prove the doubters wrong in the most public way they could imagine. Whatever it was, they bought their way on through one of those bottom-of-the-market operators, with a thin, underqualified team and a guide who did not know the full story of who he had agreed to take up, and they went up the Abruzzi Spur in a season far less crowded and far less forgiving than the one they remembered. This time there was no long line of experienced climbers around them to absorb their mistakes and break the trail. This time there was no one whose job it was to save them. This time it was just the Wexleys and the mountain, and the same bottleneck where it had all happened before, waiting exactly where they had left it. From the last camp before the summit push, Vivian posted what would be their final message to the small audience that still followed them. She wrote that they were going back to finish what the mountain had interrupted, about closure, about honoring the people who had been lost on this very slope, language that anyone who knew the truth found almost unbearable to read. She wrote about destiny, about how the mountain had spared them once for a reason, about coming full circle. She said they felt strong and ready, stronger than ever, that the weather looked perfect and the team was solid and the summit was finally within reach. She thanked their followers for never doubting them, for standing by them through what she called the lies and the jealousy of small people. She did not mention that their guide had already privately questioned whether they could move fast enough to be safe, or that the weather window was tighter than she was admitting, or that they were, once again, the slowest people on the mountain. It was the last anyone ever heard from either of them. They were too slow, exactly as they had always been, exactly as they had been the day they got 12 people killed. They reached the bottleneck late, far too late, with the day already warming the ice above them. The one mistake every experienced climber on Earth knows to avoid, and the one the Wexleys had proven 5 years earlier they would always make. They had learned nothing, because they had never had to. By that altitude, their bodies were already failing in the quiet way the death zone takes everyone, the thinking gone slow and stupid, the limbs heavy to the coordination, bleeding away with every hour. They burned above 26,000 feet, and they did not have the experience to recognize any of it for the emergency it was. And this time there was no crowd to share the risk. No long line of strong climbers ahead of them with fixed ropes already set and the trail already broken. No guides whose job it was to nurse them through. No one behind them to witness or to send for help. There was only the long, terrible exposure under the Serac, the same Serac, on the same slope, and two people who had never once in their lives been able to move fast enough or read the danger or turn back in time. They had spent 5 years and a fortune insisting they belonged up there. Now the mountain simply tested the claim. What took them is the same thing that took the 12. The Serac does not check your resume. It does not read your book. It came down the way it always comes down, and the Wexleys were exactly where they had always been. Too slow, in the worst place on the mountain, at the worst possible time.
Same mountain, same gully, same fatal slowness. Almost the same spot 5 years later. I have never seen the math come back around quite this cleanly, and it unsettles me.
Nigel and Vivian Wexley never came down off K2. They died high on the mountain, in or near the bottleneck, on the brutal exposed ground that has killed more people than any other place on that peak, in almost precisely the spot where the 12 had died 5 years before. There was no rescue, because on K2, above 26,000 feet, there is never a rescue. Only the cold and the height and the long way down that the dead do not make. The thin team they had hired could do nothing but save themselves and retreat, and even that was a near thing. No helicopter came, because none can fly that high. No one climbed up after them, because no one climbs up into that to retrieve people who are already gone. And like almost everyone who dies that high on K2, their bodies were never brought down, because recovery at that altitude is a death sentence of its own, and the mountain does not give back what it takes above the bottleneck. The few who knew the truth understood that the Wexleys would stay up there permanently now, fixed forever to the one place that had finally judged them in the cold and the silence, with the very people they had sent there ahead of them. And the mountain that cannot be bought, that does not read resumes or care about lawyers or book deals or the careful stories rich people tell about themselves, simply kept them the way it has kept so many, somewhere up there in the ice and the wind, where the only thing that has ever counted is whether you can actually do the thing, and where the answer for the Wexleys was finally and permanently no. When the news came down off the mountain, the climbing world did not pretend to mourn the way it does for its own. There were no glowing tributes, no moments of silence at the gatherings, none of the warmth the community pours out when it loses someone real. The people who knew the true story knew exactly what had happened, that the couple who got 12 people killed by being too slow under the Sarek had finally been killed by being too slow under the Sarek, that the mountain had handed down the one verdict that money could not appeal, and lawyers could not silence, and a ghostwriter could not rewrite. The widow they had threatened to sue did not have to say a word, because the mountain had said it for her, more plainly and more permanently than any court ever could. Somewhere on a shelf, their glossy survival memoir kept telling its careful lies to anyone who still bought a copy, but the people who counted had always known the truth, and now the mountain had simply, finally, agreed with them. Nigel and Vivian Wexley had spent years and a fortune outrunning what they had done, rewriting it, suing it into silence, and in the end, they ran all the way back to the exact place they had done it, and it was patiently waiting for them.
I do not believe in much, but I believe the mountains keep a ledger. These two spent 5 years and a fortune running away from what they did, and it caught them in the same spot doing the same thing.
I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn this into a story about a mountain getting revenge, and that is not really what this is. K2 has no intentions. It does not punish anyone, it does not keep score, it does not know the Wexleys existed. It simply does not forgive the things that human beings get away with everywhere else. The lies, the bought reputations, the threats, and the lawyers. The certainty that money makes the rules optional and consequences negotiable. Down here, Nigel and Vivian Wexley could buy their way past every consequence, silence every critic, rewrite every story with their faces in the center and the dead pushed to the edges of the frame. Down here, the truth was just one more thing you could outspend. Up there, none of it meant anything at all. The mountain asked them the only question it asks anyone, rich or poor, honest or fraud, which is whether they could actually do the thing they had spent years claiming they could do, and the answer was the same as it had always been. The same answer that 12 other people had paid for first. That is the part I keep coming back to. The mountain was always going to give them that answer. The only thing their money ever bought them was time, and the only people who paid for that time were everyone else. The real horror of this story is not that the mountain finally took them. It is how long and how many lives it took for that to finally happen.